restitution or restituting our historical memory and our emotional existences. Because these artifacts, at least within African cultural systems, represented more than artistic objects. They were cultural signifiers
for peace.
that explained the socialities of certain communities. So I look at a kente cloth, I look at an African mask, and I'm able to tell something about this community. They had that kind of symbolic value. So I don't think we talk about the psychological importance of these artifacts for our historical memory, for how we know each other. So if you go to the Louvre today, you will find the Mona Lisa there. And you will find exactly what the Mona Lisa means for the Western civilization. It was, at a certain point, a very instructive cultural text that framed Western civilization and how the Western civilization saw itself. The idea that it's rooted in the high Renaissance, these ideals of individuality and provenance and so on and so forth. So I'd like to think that these artifacts have a similar importance, if not more. So as to how they are able to replicate them, I think one also has to be mindful of how, and this is a big debate within museological practices, the anthropologists,
No, 100% agree. Go for it.
Anthropologists, the missionaries, the dealers, the cultural conveyors, they came into Africa with a different sentiment to try and understand the cultures. And in trying to understand, they learned from cultural makers and artists. They learned how to produce these things. They learned about, even if they didn't learn to make them themselves, but they understood the material properties in the clay. So they studied African civilizations. But in doing so, they kind of came up with a very colonial outcome. They studied in order to subjugate, not to understand them for the inherent functions, one might say. So I don't think it should surprise us when, in today's context, they have documented exactly what these artifacts or how they made and what they made of, and are able to reproduce them because they did that kind of labor. I do think that, and now it ties me back to the first point I made into your inquiry, that we should never forget what these artifacts mean and could still mean for us. For instance, right now there's a whole back and forth with France and the French government around whether to return them or not and so on. And this is in itself a very colonial technology to say we want to return them, but on the basis that you build museums. And I mean, it's quite ridiculous for people to tell you what to do with your own cultural patrimony.
Exactly my point.
It's very paternalistic for them. Naturalize. So there's that whole kind of thing, but we need to realize that this is a technology of language to naturalize the idea that Africans don't have the ideological and cultural infrastructure to take care of their own objects. So there's a production of language that's constantly emerging. And I think our task is to deepen our own language, to push back and resist this very impositional kind of colonial speak, So we need to do that kind of work. Unfortunately, this is the one instance where I will say we might have to give just a bit of attention trying to make them understand, but not too much though. It's still ignorance. It's still blatant ignorance on their part. So we need to acknowledge not only the material values of these objects. So for instance, a lot of them are still housed in Western museums. And a lot of them are in conversation to repatriate them to their former places or where they originate from. But what we don't talk about, for instance, is how these artifacts now exist within digital spaces and interfaces and economies where there are patents. And through those patents, there is another capitalist economy that exists. So there's also needs to be some kind of repatriation there. It's that if you're going to use the image of this African mask, why should the capital? So the British Museum can say, keep the object, but we'll keep the patent.
Yeah.
And they make millions from that on. So every film that's ever going to come now that will include an African mask will have some kind of capital flow back to the British Museum. So these are the technologies that we have to wrestle with. But my point is that we need to be equally agile, if not aggressive, in our languaging, in our deconstruction of the many layers of this problem. And because, fortunately, those of us in the arts who have an appreciation for aesthetics and have a capacity for language, we are more positioned to do this kind of work.
Don't you think, like, I'm sorry to say, but, you know, it is, for me with these artifacts, I feel it is a lot more than the eyes can see. Taking this artifact back, I think what we should also consider in the long term is remittance. They should remit to us. I'm looking at it in that aspect. So whenever movies or things comes out in large quantities, we don't get to lose too much. Because, yeah, that's one point I'm looking at. And also another aspect is when we talk about psychologically, those artifacts live in these different African countries. Do we know that it has implication on the land? And then, if this artifacts has to be returned, there's some kind of rituals that has to be performed. Otherwise, when this artifact comes back, it becomes another problem. Are you looking at it in that aspect?
Yes, absolutely, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole cosmology. Earlier on, I think it was before you arrived,
Yeah.
I started introducing myself to the group. I talked about cosmology from our African cultures in South Africa, where we describe ourselves or we locate ourselves in relation to other beings. So I'll talk about my clan name, that I am Kalambonra, I come from this clan or this tribe, and this tribe has a cosmic relation to this kind of animal, and this kind of animal has a cosmic relation to another entity, and this fills an ecosystem of a life form, it creates a life form. So I imagine that these objects are not divorced from these life forms, they actually form part of these life forms. So I do think it has spiritual implications and connotations. I do think it has value for us to retrieve these. That's why we have diviners who help us administer these processes.
Okay. Okay then.
I think it's very very important points what you raise about these questions of restitution, but even more that how I see that it's a question also of community and background, and not just about the object as we think in the Western context. Because in the Western context you talk about the object and you cut any kind of historical ties. So what you imply, it's really, and also what Tabang then responded, it's to think about a much larger context from where what is there stolen, it's coming, but also the implication really of technology. No? In the end, you can return, but the benefits that were already taken through the way how these artifacts were staying in the museum, the narratives that were done, the profits that were produced, I think this is still there.
That's why I'm talking about remittance.
Yes. So,
there has to be remittance, continuous one. Otherwise, I don't see this working. I feel when France is talking about restitution, returning it, it's propaganda. If you look at it, it's politics.
It's not only propaganda. It's about profit. It's about ideology. It's about power. So it's not just propaganda. It's a whole mechanisms of keep the things as it was, and not to actually change them also. And then it's different mechanisms how to keep this. If it's not possible to keep, then it's actually a process of denigration. Not capable, you cannot do this, you cannot protect, everything will fall apart. We only know, but this is coming as a second step. The first step is to say, this is what we have. Historically, we cannot actually go back, and we don't want to change. Then, under pressure, it's other mechanism that is implied. And simply why? Because these museums we see very well in Austria. They are imperial structures fully, and they also are not just imperial in terms of certain context, but they are actually bringing money, profit, because the entrance in the museum is 16 euro to 20 euros.
Yeah.
This is a lot of money. This is really about money. It's about profit. In the last instance, it's not even about anything there, but this kind of a myth that is reproduced and brings money. And so I think that point is key for all the space of Europe. Especially the Occidental, not in the Eastern part.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
we can maybe come to the end, if you allow me to say why, because we will open many of these questions on Friday.
Okay.
There will come other